Ladies and gentlemen, what do we want from our local MP? Do we want them out there fighting to reduce crime in our area, to boost the economy in our area, to reduce unemployment in our area? Or do we want them on the internet making a fool of themselves, talking nonsense on the back of delusional conspiracy theories while simultaneously trying to raise their own private army? Now, when it comes to talking nonsense, Andrew Bridgen, the MP for North West Leicestershire, is an absolute ninja. Last year, he was removed from the Conservative Party for a reckless tweet in which he compared the vaccines produced during the pandemic to the Holocaust itself. And according to his wife in today's edition of the Sunday Times, things have only got worse for Andrew as he's been radicalised by an anti-vax cult. Now, I wasn't joking before with the reference to raising a personal army. This is taken from his website. Now, when I tried to access that website this morning, I got this message here saying that the website's bandwidth limit has been exceeded, which means one of two things. Either this website is so popular that thousands and thousands of people are trying to access it all at once, or the server that he bought to run the website is made of potato. But it does appear that the Sunday Times were able to access the website, as they report Andrew writing, "Being a phone soldier in Andrew's army will require courage." And I'm sure it will. For people who are afraid of phones. Apparently it will not be for the faint-hearted. Now, I know that might sound comical and surreal, but it stops being funny when you listen to what he's got to say on this interview here, which was a recent interview with Jim Ferguson. In fact, in this interview, he says some of the most bizarre and quite frankly reckless things that I have ever heard from a politician in my entire life, and that is even when I compare it to this.
I know the human being and fish can coexist peacefully.
I mean, that's a nice dream and all, but those finned fuckers really piss me off at times. Anyway, it's time to get serious and break down what Andrew Bridgen said in this most bizarre of interviews. We're going to break it down into different chunks and we're going to address it as best as we possibly can. So, put your feet up, get yourself a hot drink, cast this to the big TV, and let's go down the rabbit hole. Now, as you've probably guessed, the topic of this interview is the excess deaths that are occurring after the pandemic. And rather than give a considered and thoughtful scientific appraisal of the situation, Andrew and Jim here crank the conspiracy dial all the way up to 11 and come out with nonsense about a secret war against humanity.
We've had war declared upon us, Andrew, I think, as a human race. I don't think there's any other way to look at it.
I think you're absolutely right. We are in a war. We're in a war for humanity's future. And the sad thing is that the majority of people in the world don't even know there's a war going on. And we need the reinforcements, Jim.
And maybe that's the idea behind Andrew's army, to be those reinforcements fighting the battle by making prank phone calls in the middle of the night. But the barmy doesn't stop there, as Jim goes on to explain this secret war in a little bit more detail.
I believe they knew in advance what they were doing, and that there is something far darker, Andrew, far darker, far more nefarious going on here. And I've had top doctors on my channel here, which is on a regular basis, who have said, Jim, we believe there is a depopulation agenda going on here. We believe that eugenics, or I should say the darker side of eugenics, is playing a part. People like Bill Gates, they believe there's too many people and too few resources.
Now, first of all, I want to examine the claim that Jim made about having top doctors onto his show. For example, is one of those so-called top doctors Dr. William Mackis here? Now, Dr. William Mackis could be the subject of an entire video all by himself, but for now, it's enough to know that if you check out his Twitter account, he has an extremely unsavoury habit of just tweeting out the deaths of people that he has no association with and has never treated, and in many, many, many cases has never met. Yet he has no shame in posting out information about their deaths and falsely linking it to the vaccine. And from time to time, these ridiculous insensitive tweets will reach the eyes of family members and friends of the deceased, which, of course, is going to cause an awful lot of distress. Now, to remove any doubt that Andrew Bridgen has obviously lost the ability to think rationally and critically about the situation, he seems to just nod along and accept this claim of some secret worldwide eugenics program.
It's difficult when you see everything that's going on come to any other conclusion. I think, as unpalatable as that is, I always think we have to live in the world how it is, not how we'd like it to be. And that would appear to me to be a very credible explanation.
Now, I don't know why Andrew Bridgen would just nod along and accept that, and I also don't know why he would recently tweet out this completely fake document that was doing the rounds on Facebook years ago that seems to suggest that a new world order has the goal of ending the family unit and having children raised by the government. Now, despite Andrew's tweet gaining itself a community note, and despite people like myself informing him that this is indeed a well-known fake document, the tweet didn't get deleted, and for some reason he never seemed to acknowledge that he just posted a fake document, almost as if the details and the truth aren't that important.
And if in fact there is a darker agenda going on here, where there is an effort to depopulate the world of significant amounts of people, then that is a crime against humanity.
Ah yes, the crimes against humanity, one of the most overused phrases in the anti-vax community. But how will Andrew Bridgen try to combat these so-called crimes against humanity? What does he want to see happen? Well, let's hear from the man himself.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've always opposed capital punishment on the principle that it's wrong to take a life, so it can't be right for the state to take a life in revenge. Events have caused me to reconsider my position. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, can we have a debate on crimes against humanity and the appropriate punishment for those who perpetuate, collude and cover up for these atrocities and crimes so severe that the ultimate punishment may be required?
Now, I think that comments like that are quite irresponsible, especially when you are alluding to some completely made-up, fictional, worldwide eugenics program that you've got literally zero evidence for. But luckily, in this situation, at least the response he received was as close as you are going to get in British politics to somebody just saying the words, "Listen, sit down, son, and shut the fuck up."
I think the honourable gentleman's incredibly subtle question is not lost on anyone in this House where he might be taking it. It is appropriate that the finale of this session, which has featured so heavily conspiracy theories, should fall to the honourable gentleman. And I would just caution him also just to reflect with the things that have been said about his own behaviour, what he does on social media, the security measures that have had to be stepped up for honourable members in this place in the wake of some of his social media tweets and questions in this House. Whatever my disagreements with the honourable gentleman, I will always stand ready to get answers from departments and assist the honourable gentleman in his work. But I'm going to call out on every occasion when he is doing things that are, I think, a danger to our democracy and also the safety and security of members of this House.
So Andrew's position is pretty clear on this topic, but what evidence is he going to bring to support it? Well, that brings us to Chapter 2.
Basically, I've had some friends and in London who are based in London, and they were very, very close to someone who'd very recently or imminently had retired from one of the American three-letter services, and he said, we're going to have a pandemic. This is in August 19. We're going to have a pandemic, and he told them, and you shouldn't be taking any of the so-called vaccines or using any of the tests, the PCR tests.
Yep, you heard that correctly. According to Andrew Bridgen, he had some mates who had a mate who told them in 2019 that the pandemic was coming. Now, Andrew does go on to say that he himself wasn't made aware of this conversation until 2020, but that still means that he was aware of this conversation before the vaccine rollout in January 2021. Yet these tweets that he makes in early 2021 are doing nothing but celebrating and promoting the use of the vaccine. In fact, he actually did a really good job at that. Thank you, Andrew. One of my favourite is this one from January the 5th, 2021, where he's clearly saying that the government should use all of their power to accelerate the rollout of the vaccine. Now, you're going to have to forgive me for being really confused here. Are we supposed to believe that Andrew Bridgen had some mates who had a mate who just retired from the FBI or CIA or UPS, and that this anonymous mate of his mates happened to know everything that was going to happen over the next few years? And are we also supposed to believe that, armed with this information in advance, Andrew Bridgen decided to ignore it and support the rollout of the vaccines anyway? Now, that doesn't sound something like the Andrew Bridgen I know would do. Maybe he's simply confused. But if he was confused and he'd forgotten what he was told, according to news reports I found, this wouldn't be the first time. Like in this report here, which details a time a High Court judge said that Andrew Bridgen had lied. Now, according to this report, he contacted a police inspector called Helena Bacter, and he asked Inspector Bacter to investigate a 7-figure fraud that he said had been perpetrated by his brother. The article then goes on to claim that Mr. Bridgen later just forgot that he'd made a phone call to the police to ask them to investigate his brother for a 7-figure fraud. And I understand that because obviously conversations like that are pretty mundane and instantly forgettable. Now, obviously, I'm not aware of the details of the case, and in Mr. Bridgen's defence, maybe the whole thing was just made up perhaps by Helena Bacter, or perhaps it wasn't him who made the phone call, perhaps somebody else had set up a secret phone army and were attacking him with these prank phone calls to the police, pretending to be him. Now, in a more sensible move, instead of just talking about mates of a mate, Andrew Bridgen now turns his attention to the ONS. I'll let him explain what that is all about.
Well, the ONS stands for the Office of National Statistics in the UK. They are seen as the holders of data and the presenters of data in a form that can be understood by the public.
Yes, and the ONS data does show just how effective the vaccines have been. If you Google ONS deaths and click on this link here, this will take you to this page here. If you then scroll down the page and click on this link on the right hand side, you'll be given access to data about deaths linked to vaccine status. That link will take you to yet another page, and if you scroll down, you'll be able to see a green button here. That's the one we want, or you can download a summary as a PDF above. But if we click on the green button and then on this link here, we are finally going to arrive at this page where we can download the data in spreadsheet format. Now, this spreadsheet will give you all the data you need on deaths between April 2021 and May 2023. We are going to concentrate a lot of our attention on column D, as this breaks down the deaths by vaccination status. Now, for every month between April 21 and May 23, we can see that we are given information on the unvaccinated, and if we scroll down to this cell here, the ever vaccinated. Now, what the ever vaccinated means is anybody who's ever had one or more COVID vaccine. This is specifically for COVID vaccination data and no other type of vaccine. Now, for each of those groups, we are given the age standardised mortality rate per 100,000 person years. So, for example, in April 2021, we have an age standardised mortality rate per 100,000 person years of 2,088.1. And what that essentially means is if we looked at 100,000 people for 1 year, 2,088.1 of them will die. If we compare that to this cell here, to the ever vaccinated group, we can see that for April 2021, that was only 812.7. So obviously in April 2021, the vaccinated were doing far, far better than the unvaccinated. What you can do then is you can collect these numbers from April 21 all the way through to May 23 for the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, and you can compare them in a table like this. Or you can create a chart like this, which shows that it is the unvaccinated who have constantly had the higher death rate. It is that simple. That is what the data says. Now, Andrew Bridgen seems to have two problems with the ONS data. Let's hear the first one.
The old argument that you were classed as unvaccinated up to 14 days after you'd had your vaccination, or if you weren't fully vaccinated. And they've rebased those figures so many times, and there are so many errors in them that they're not useful as a data set to argue whether vaccination actually improves or decreases mortality.
So his argument here is an old tired one, that you're not classed as being vaccinated until 14 days after you've had your vaccine. But what he clearly isn't taking into account is if you open the spreadsheet, we can literally see that the data has been broken down into different vaccination statuses. And if he wants to dig into the data that shows the deaths for people who've been vaccinated for less than 21 days, he can do that.
The ONS are set to rebase their 5-year rolling average of expected mortality. They say they're rebasing it for an aging population and an increasing population. And at first look, this could knock 27,000 or increase the expected deaths by about 27,000, which would probably remove half the excess at the moment.
Now, he is right that the way baseline death rate is going to be calculated is being changed, and we can see the mathematics of that all laid out and explained perfectly on the ONS website here. However, let's examine the claim that this is somehow going to have a significant effect on excess deaths. And for that, I want to give a big shout out to this Twitter channel here. If you're on Twitter, I highly recommend giving this guy a follow. His content is absolute gold. Now, he's compared the deaths in 2024 so far to both the old method and the new method. The red line is what will be predicted using the new method. The grey line is what will be predicted using the old method. And we can see there is a slight difference. However, the key is the thick, bold black line underneath. That is the death rate for 2024 so far. In other words, whether we're comparing to the new rate or whether we're comparing to the old rate, deaths this year are actually below what will be expected. In fact, we're about 7% fewer than will be expected. Anyway, while we're on the topic of shouting out some great Twitter channels, I'd also like to shout out Nolan Biscuit Overlord, who always has his finger on the pulse when it comes to calling out misinformation. And if we turn our eye to YouTube, I don't think we can do any better than subscribe to the Back to the Science YouTube channel, which really does a great job in debunking a lot of this anti-science misinformation. So how can it be that when we look at the data, it just simply doesn't support the implication made by Mr. Bridgen that vaccines are causing excess deaths? Now, he doesn't address this topic directly, but I think this clip here might perhaps sum up his personal opinion on that.
All our regulators and all the institutions that are tasked with protecting the public interest, the MHRA, Department of Health, the medical industry, the scientists, the universities. We've got the best universities in the world, but they've been bought and corrupted.
Anyway, moving on. Chapter 3. What's he going to do about it?
Well, I actually will share with you, Jim, which is not publicised yet. I actually wrote on Monday to Mark Rowley, the Commissioner for the Metropolitan Police, and I've asked for a 3-hour meeting where I will bring 15 world experts and whistleblowers who will lay out the evidence that criminal activity is being conducted by those at the top of government and in the civil servants.
Now, at this point, I've got to ask myself who these so-called whistleblowers and experts might be. So I've reached my hand right round the U-bend of the content of Jim Ferguson and Andrew Bridgen in the past, and I've tried to fish out some floaters which might just help me predict exactly who he's going to be taking to this meeting.
Professor Rancourt, when I met him in Ottawa a few months ago, he said that there's at least 20 million people who have died as a direct result of the vaccines themselves.
Now, the only Professor Rancourt I could find was this man here, Dennis Rancourt, who's got quite the interesting Wikipedia page which talks about grade inflation and academic squatting. Really is quite an interesting read. But of course, as you might expect, as somebody who could possibly be an expert for Andrew Bridgen, is he's not actually a medical doctor or trained in virology or anything like that at all. But he did claim, according to this article at least, that vaccines had killed 17 million people. Obviously, by the time he spoke to Jim Ferguson, he assumed that that had gone up by another 3 million. The only problem is his claim is absolute nonsense and totally unsupported. And it does appear, at least from reading this page here, that he's based that assumption on the fact that there was no virulent pathogen that came onto the planet. So in other words, when he was performing his analysis on data into death, he just simply would not take into consideration that those deaths could have been caused by COVID. However, when the data he was using was analysed properly, we can see something like this. This is some data for Singapore. The blue line represents the vaccine rollout and the red line represents spikes in COVID. The grey areas are deaths. And we can clearly see a very definite correlation between an increase in cases in COVID and an increase in death, and not the same when we look at the vaccines. Now, the second expert or whistleblower I thought that Andrew Bridgen could be bringing to this party is YouTuber Dr. John Campbell. The two of them do have a bit of a history. But I don't know if Dr. John Campbell will have the time, because he seems quite busy on Twitter at the minute sharing pictures of mysterious white clots that are actually not white clots, but actually blood vessels. And of course, just like Andrew Bridgen did earlier on, he seems to be ignoring the community posts that are placed onto his incorrect tweets. Now, other pictures of clots he's sharing are actually clots, and they seem to be concerning him as he's asking the question, how long can these be ignored? Well, fear no more, John, because as you are being told over and over and over again by proper medical doctors on Twitter, these are not mysterious new clots. They are a well-documented case of agonal thrombi. But I'm sure as soon as you get around to reading those posts, you will absolutely tweet out a correction and tell everybody just how wrong you were. I know you will do that. I have 100% faith in you. Now, in one of his tweets, John Campbell credits a Mr. John Looney. So I wonder if Mr. John Looney could be one of Andrew Bridgen's expert witnesses. And I do hope so. I think he will be an absolutely perfect fit for Andrew Bridgen. We can see several news articles online describing him as a leading anti-vaxxer. An anti-vaxxer, apparently, who did refer to the coronavirus as being just the common cold and refused to be vaccinated, before catching it and ending up in intensive care. But don't worry, he bounced back and now he's got a different conspiracy theory, and that is that people who've been vaccinated against COVID will illuminate under a certain light. He then seems to suggest a genius plan where we can use that information to find out if politicians have been vaccinated by shining a special torch on them. Anyway, I'm sure whoever Andrew Bridgen takes to his meeting will be very special indeed. Anyway, while we pop off now back to the completely real world, we can just check in and have one last listen at the imaginary conspiracy world, where we can simply say things like there is a worldwide eugenics program without having any evidence of that whatsoever. And we can listen to Andrew and we can listen to Jim come up with perhaps the beginning of a plan. A plan that through its own moronic simplicity is also genius. You see, when you are fighting against something that simply doesn't exist and is never going to happen anyway, you simply can't lose. It's brilliant.
It's going to take leaders, people in Parliament like yourself, but it's also going to take military leaders, those within the intelligence services who have a conscience and who know what's going on. Even if their bosses at the top are going along with it, they are going to have to rise to the challenge. They are going to have to be the ones that come forward and say, sorry, sir, but you are being removed from power because you are being complicit in this.
Yeah, let's just leave him to it, shall we?